Hey, all you crazy sci-fi and fantasy fans, it's time for your daily dose of shenanigans over here at the Blasters and Blades podcast. Just three nerdy veterans geeking out over our science fiction passions and fantastical fantasies. A place where magic is king, the sky is the limit, and space is the place. We are the podcast that puts the fun in dysfunction. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce the topic. So if you're listening on the YouTubes, you can see the image. You already know what's going on. If you're listening, you read the title, I hope. But we're doing another Fireside Chat just to mix things up. And since we are entering into the spooky season of Spooktober, we figured why not talk about vampires? We've done horror. We've talked about Hocus Pocus. Now let's talk about vampires. So before we get this started on the topic at hand, we're going to let our panelists introduce themselves. So I went in alphabetical order, not by order of preference because you're all special to me. But David Carrico, could you introduce yourself to our listeners and viewers?
Sure. I'm David Carrico. I write science fiction and fantasy, ranging all the way from alternate history in Eric Flint's Ring of Fire universe to my most recent novel, which is a vampire novel with a twist.
All right. Next, Declan. Can you introduce yourself to our audience?
Sure. My name is Declan Finn. As penance for my sins, I have lived the last 40 years of my life in New York City. I am the author of 30 published novels, 4 of which are vampires. And 2 of the vampire novels were nominated for Dragon Awards in, 2016 and 17? The first two Dragon Awards, where I basically decided I was going to make the vampire mythos make sense because, good God, it's all over the place. But I will write pretty much anything that's not nailed down and some things that are.
All right. And Griffin, first, can we say I love your backdrop? That's well touched. And you got the dark one sort of haloing you. So was that planned? I don't know, but well done.
Just to match my soul, so I can beat my head against the wall.
Yeah, I get it, and I approve. But can you introduce yourself to our audience?
I'm Griffin Garber. I'm a retired police officer and author. I've also written with Eric Flint, as David did, on the 1632 universe. I also write fantasy and a little bit of horror and some science fiction as well. I've got a couple of stories that involve a necromancer who's also a little bit of a vampire. And they've been out in a couple of different anthologies, and I'm working on the novel for it. Using that character as well. So okay. I'm very happy to be here tonight.
I always assumed vampires was like being pregnant. You either are or you aren't. How do you become a little bit of a vampire?
Well,
depends on what you feed on. If it's the blood or if it's something else. So the psychic vampire of what we do in the shadows is
okay.
Another element of that. So yeah. A little bit like that.
I will take it. All right. Miss Julia, can you introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. I'm Julia V. It's nice to be back on the show. This is a much more relaxing format. Also, I love this topic, and not to be left out, I was a student of Eric Flint's, so it's really wonderful to be here with you guys. My co-author and I, Ken, we have a trilogy debuting with Tor next summer. It's a contemporary fantasy with Asian-inspired elements set in San Francisco. But for fun, we did write a Vampire Slayer series. It's set in post-apocalyptic Seattle. It's called the Seattle Slayer series, and this is probably right on point for me, this topic tonight.
And we're here for it. All right. Miss Tamsin Silver.
Hey, Tamsin Silver. I write with Falstaff Books. I have a lot of vampire stuff out, actually. It's why my Billy the Kid stuff doesn't have a vampire join until part of the 3rd book, because I was like, we got a lot of those going on. So I've got Mark the Necromancer. Interestingly enough, she too is a vampire necromancer, so I feel like maybe we're in the same universe somehow. There, Griffin. But then I've also got the Sky of the Damned series, which started off as a web series when I lived in New York City. That's where we filmed that, and then I continued it in book format. And so the 1st and 2nd book of that are out. And then I also have the Windfire series, which is the first thing that I ever did, and that is the Windfire world. And there'll be a new trilogy in that world coming out from Falstaff, coming out in the next year, called Moon Over Manhattan, which is a continuation of more vampires and werewolves in New York.
Okay, so I figure if we're going to talk about vampires, we're going to start with defining what is a vampire. And so I'm going in random order, but Griffin, you're going to go first this time.
What is a vampire? Something that consumes the essence of others in order to survive, others of its own kind. So leeches, that kind of thing, the vampire bat, but anything that actually has to feed upon its own kind in order to prolong its own life.
Okay, Julia. I keep saying Julie. I don't know why. I got that stuck in my head and it's wrong, and I apologize.
It's
Julia.
fine. So, hearkening back to Twilight, one of the great classics, I would say that, I was team Jacob. And part of that was because werewolves were alive and vampires were dead, right? So for me, the primary adjective when I think of vampires is I think of undead, right? Their hearts don't beat. Their blood doesn't pump, right? And like Griffin said, they need something from somebody else in order to live, right?
Okay. Declan, what about you? How would you define a vampire?
It must be a supernatural creature. It is not something that appears in nature. It is not something natural. It's not something cute and cuddly. Not that I have any pet peeves about this or anything. Yes, must live off of the essence of someone else. And that's a great way to put it, Griffin, because you've got incubi, which are a kind of vampire, which do live off of non-fluid related items from people. Yes, living animated corpses are optional, as far as I can tell, although I've had some fun with that. And yes, they must be a supernatural thing, not bound by the laws of nature. And yeah, they are basically a supernatural parasite that looks like a person.
Okay. What about you, David? Do you agree with that?
Yes and no. My own story doesn't quite follow most of those tropes, but traditionally, those are what we've been hearing are the things that would normally apply to someone in the vampiric condition. I like the word parasite. I think that's particularly fitting for the concept of the undead.
Okay. And what about you, Miss Tamsin?
We've hit all of it pretty much. I mean, I know that I was on a panel at Dragon Con and someone talked about how they felt that if it was a vampire story, that blood needed to be involved. If it we're sticking with the regular mythos of some kind. Psychic vampires I've also seen done very well. But I do think it's a creature that is superhuman in some way, shape, or form, that has extra powers they can choose to do good or bad with. Declan and I totally have some that are good people, so sorry. I also have a form of living vampire in my Windfire series, so I don't necessarily need them to be dead. It's an interesting play on a concept of something I read once and twisted around the way I wanted it. But for me, they need to be superhuman. They need to have abilities that they have to make decisions. For me, it's about character. It's about what choices do you make with what you're given. And so for me, they have powers and they have to make decisions on whether or not they use them for good, bad, in between, how that affects who they are. And so for me, vampires are supernatural creatures that definitely cannot survive without finding a way to use other people. And how they do that affects who they are as a person or dead person or whatever.
So, Griff, you had mentioned the essence, consuming the essence was what made a vampire. So how would you define essence? Are you talking, using fancy words to just mean blood? Or
no, well, I mean, that's one of the traditionally that was what people thought, right? The four humors, et cetera, that made up people's blood, et cetera. So the essence being that, in to stretch it in my case, and also in the fine point that Declan brought up was the succubus or incubus, feeding off of the desires of a person, that kind of thing. In my fantasy that I'm working on, it's pretty dark, but they're feeding off the souls of the recently deceased, preventing them from joining the gods in the afterlife. So they're really despicable monsters in regard to that. So one of the most fun things about about the whole trope is, just as Tamsin said, is trying to make this character who is obviously not going to be the best situated to be a good guy, to make them somebody that the reader wants to engage with and follow along in the story. So, feeding on that essence, whatever it is, it can be blood, but it could also be spirit. It could be their energies when they're engaged on a particular topic, etc. That kind of thing. So that's my long answer for that short question.
So would consuming the souls make them even more horrific than just drinking their blood?
I would say so, yes.
Okay. So are there, well, first off, would you consider, and this is to everybody, and I can point and call people out, or we can just do an open sort of panel discussion, but do you think that there are certain tropes a book has to have to be a vampire story?
Not necessarily. I mean, hell, my own personal vampire story was, it's going to look like it's going to be, quote, a vampire romance, and then there was, well, way too many explosions for that. But no, they're all over the map. Have you seen some of these things? You've got the vampire romance angle, which who thought Bela Lugosi would have had vampire romance in a genre coming down the pike sooner or later? Especially when you read the original Bram Stoker. Nobody was thinking, oh, this is going to be love story stuff. No. You've got the horror genre. You've got the urban fantasy genre. You have, heck, Jim Butcher by himself has got 4 different types of vampire kicking around just the Harry Dresden universe. So it's all over the place. And frankly, you can use metaphysical concepts like I did, and I think even David did. I use metaphysics because I cheated. One of my majors was philosophy. So it's like, yes, we're going to take Thomas Aquinas and we're going to inflict it on vampires. No, my professors did not see that coming. So they're all over the place. Hell, how many people just use vampires as a substitute for, well, I don't want to explain superpowers, so we're going to just make it vampires.
I do think it's trope specific, right? If you are reading a romance and you're a romance reader, you have expectations of what should be in there. And I was enjoying a panel at Dragon Con talking about this, right? Where some of the early stuff like Bram Stoker, right? It comes from horror, but the notion of penetration, I think, is hard to avoid, right? There's fangs. So if you are a romance reader, there is definitely something there about the traditional vampire approach. The other thing too is because they're long-lived, right? They amass wealth and power, and maybe they have secret societies. And so that becomes very alluring in urban fantasy and other fantasy contexts. So I do think it just depends, what your genre is. If you're writing monster stuff, then the vampire, the horror aspect, I think, becomes maybe more predominant.
Okay, what about you, David? Do you think there are tropes that have to be there? I know from talking to you, you did lots of research and you categorized all of them. So weigh in.
Okay, I'm the introvert, and it's taking me a minute to get my words flowing.
Oh, you are okay.
Basically, I don't think that all of the tropes have to be there. there's probably a certain minimalist set that you need to have, and the whole idea of parasitism would be one of them. I don't think undead necessarily it has to be. I don't think that demonic influences or inherent evil necessarily has to be part of the vampire story. I've read too many stories in the last 10 years where people are trying to do the same thing now that they did with demons 20 years ago. They're trying to make good guys out of vampires, so that a lot of the standard tropes don't necessarily need to apply, but there has to be a certain minimalist set. And I think the idea of super strength, the idea of longevity, the idea of the parasitic consumption, and to some extent even the idea of are they even human, comes into play in one way or another in most vampire stories.
And to what extent they still are.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Especially after they've lived a very long time, right?
Yeah.
Okay. What about you, Griffin? Do you feel like there are certain tropes, if you want to expound on what David said, that have to be there?
Well, the cool thing is I read, I was lucky enough to be one of the first readers for David's The Blood is the Life, and really dug it because it has all the conspiracy trope kind of stuff going on, where and government involvement and trying to figure out or para-government involvement and trying to figure out what's going on with the curse or the state of being that vampires are in. So it's just like, anytime any discussion of tropes is going to be a long and lengthy one, given that it pretty much, as Declan was saying, you can kind of paint with a broad brush and hit a lot of those points. The key is that if the reader is going, yeah, this is a vampire story, and you drag them through the whole thing and leave them satisfied at the end, yeah, that was a pretty cool vampire story, then I think you've done your job with whether or not you hit every single trope or were a minimalist and just hit 2 or 3 like David was talking about. You just have the ones.
Okay. Would you like to expound on that, Tamsin?
No, I don't think. I think we've covered a lot of it. I think there are expectations people have when they know it's a vampire story. I think the fact that they have something to do with fangs or teeth or that, I think that's something that needs to be there. Because I think there's a romanticism about some of that, which, as much as we all love Twilight, that was a thing. Like she even dreamed about like what it'd be like to be like, they romanticize it, and I think that's something that needs to be there somehow. I think there's just certain things people are looking for when they say it's a vampire novel. They want them to be tortured souls. They want them to be either evil or they want them to be good. Like they want one or the other. They like to see that. So yeah, I think it really just comes down to good characterization.
Well, and the aspect of that too, the mesmerism of the very dangerous predator staring at you and wanting you, and you being like, oh no, I'm not.
Yeah, I don't have any. I don't have any choice.
Right. Or the opposite. Like I'm going to resist. I'm actually going to resist. But that predator is, it's the same, I think it's kind of harkens back to the same creepy influence that, the mass murderers get fans, they get fan clubs.
Yes.
And shit.
Yes.
No. I think that there's kind of a similarity there. And you're able to kind of explore that with vampire fiction in a safe manner, surrendering control, this really lethal predator who would, otherwise be considered, something to be hunted down and killed. All of these things are possible in a romantic setting, given that you've surrendered to these particular tropes that are being along in it. One of the things that I kind of was interested in too is that how it migrated from even in Bram Stoker's it migrates from basically a very rural, very medieval kind of setting to a very intensely urban setting. And how most of the stuff we refer to now is almost all urban in nature. Like that's the vampire's natural kind of hiding place,
hunting ground.
Well, you know, it's
feeding
interesting you say
territory.
that. Right? But it's interesting you say that. Like, I actually make reference to that in the Windfire series. They're all hanging out at a goth industrial club where I used to hang out in New York and other places. And, like, there were people there that thought themselves vampires, or they just, like, the best place they could hide, man. Like, hang out in the goth industrial scene, the way you dress, no one's going to know any different. You're pale? That's totally the goth scene. No one cares. Like, wearing fangs? Totally normal there. Like, wearing all black, being really mysterious in the shadows, only seen in the evening, totally the goth scene. Like, there are some reasons why it does fit better in that kind of situation for me. Oh, I'm so sorry, my dog.
It is okay. So every origin, every piece of lore, generally speaking, has the first that comes into being. So is there a commonly agreed upon first vampire in fiction? Or is that universe or, author dependent?
Define fiction, because if you want to go into mythology fiction as fiction, no, not really. Because you've got Lilith on one end, you've got I think there's a blood drinking monster in everybody's mythology. I haven't studied literally everybody on the planet, but you turn around, it's on almost every continent, I think. So if you're counting mythology as fiction, the answer is no. If you're talking about each individual person's world, I don't even know if I have that narrowed down yet. No, actually, I have it narrowed down. It was a head cold from a blood-drinking fae that jumped species and then had very nasty side effects in humans. But that's me.
Okay. Griffin is nodding along. So do you think there is a commonly agreed upon? Because I'd heard in some of the vampire stories it was Judas was the first vampire. But that's obviously very specific to one.
Well, it's funny that we've been talking about Dragon Con, which takes place in Atlanta, which is also the home of World of Darkness, which is the most successful vampire role-playing game ever embodied. They have Cainites, is what they call their vampires. So they're descended from Cain and the story of Cain and Abel and that kind of thing. So, and I've heard that, and then also the spear guy that speared Jesus on the cross, Longinus. Is it Longinus?
Yeah,
I can't remember.
Don't
Thank
remember
you,
his name.
So he was the predecessor for all vampires as well, being cursed by God because he stuck a steel pointy thing into Jesus' side. So I think that, like Declan was saying, it's very, very widespread as a mythology. So there's a lot of room to play around with the origin stories for, and any given vampire may or may not know, which is also very fun to play with. David does it quite well with his story. And I've also seen it done with, pretty much everybody that's one of the elements of it is that mystery, right? Where does it all come from? Where does this curse come from?
Well, it's answering questions, right? So if you are looking at a lot of, like you had mentioned, Griffin, that it starts in this sort of rural area and now we think of it as intensely urban, but probably they needed to answer these questions about their dead, right? And this was one of the answers they came up with. And even outside of Western culture, you have something known as hopping vampires when you get to Asia, and that is also a way of answering questions. And so I think most people would agree that, like, from a fictionalized standpoint, there's some early entry points in Western film and Western literature, and that's how most of us now think of it, right? But if we're writing our own worlds and setting it up, like Faith Hunter does use that story that you talked about, right? Like the son, or I'm not the son, sorry, the Jesus on the cross, right? That's the origin story for, the person that injures him is the one that starts that mythology, and in New Orleans, ends up in New Orleans, right? Like, so also intensely urban, right?
No, of course it's urban. You go where the food is.
Right. Well, and that's the thing too. Is the city the monster, and is the big whale, and the vampire is the lamprey feeding off the whale in the city. It's really not about. Is it really about the people, or is it about the city?
I always thought it was about obscurity, right? Like if you live such a long time, people will notice that you don't age. So like the city is a good place to hide and go from city to city and then pretend to be your son or your own grandson or whatever, right?
That's true.
So do you have anything to add to that one, Tamsin, or are you agreeing with what the other four have said on this one?
What I think so wonderful about the whole vampire lore is, I mean, I have used the Cain one. I've actually also used the entire Bible to support an entire line of all of them. My mother's like, church is going to be pissed. I'm like, awesome. Bad press is good press. Let's go. But I think that's one of the cool things is that you get to make that up on your own. You get to create that world. You get to make that decision. But yeah, I think one of the most popular ones, other than Cain, is definitely Lilith. And I really do apologize to everyone listening for my Australian Shepherd, who is louder than anything else on the planet. So
At least
yeah,
it's not Elvis this time. That's my dog.
So yeah, but I honestly, I agree with most everyone. I mean, like everybody knows of them, the usuals you can use. I mean, I used the usual one in my first series because it was my first time writing and I wanted to kind of go with that. But I've branched out with that in the Billy the Kid series that uses the idea of some Irish folklore as the starting for them. So that's kind of the beauty is what do you need for your series and where can you pull from, and I think that's what's really great about writing vampire stories. You get to choose.
Okay. Well, we're about to dive into some fun questions that might get this conversation going. So before we do that, we're going to pause for a moment while we shamelessly shill for the man.
Here comes your next romp in the graveyard. In Hunters for Hire, a new urban fantasy adventure by best-selling author Jonathan Yanez, a guy down on his luck puts sign twirling and rideshare driving on the back burner to track down the supernatural for a pretty penny. Find out what happens when John Hunter enters the secret underworld. Download your copy and start listening today. Now available on Amazon and Audible.
All right, so we're back talking about vampires. And so, Julie, you had mentioned something about one of the reasons that vampires move to cities is because they can hide in plain sight and because they can hide their longevity by pretending to be the descendant, et cetera, of their family. And wow, you just have a really strong likeness in your family. So in an age that has gone remarkably digital, the age being, modern times, do you think it's the responsibility of the various lore creators, the authors, the movie makers, et cetera, to cover how they do that in an age where people like Griffin Barber could track you down and say, yeah, that identity isn't real? And since you mentioned it, we'll go to you first.
There's a series I love by Elizabeth Hunter, and she has it's almost like Jim Butcher's Harry Dresden character. The vampires there can't interact with technology. Something about their biology like shorts out computers, and so they have to hire human assistants to solve these issues. And what I love about that is it creates opportunity for this constant engagement between vampires and humans, right? And then again, answering that question, like who's the monster, who's the human, right? Who has humanity in those relationships? And I do think readers will suspend disbelief because they've picked up a fantasy novel. Like they know that you are going to have your own rules in your world, and it's okay, right? You should address technology, make it fun, and make it a rule that you stick with, right? As you're going through your series.
Okay. What about you, Tamsin? Since I've been asking you to give you a chance to weigh in and wow us all first this time. Well, almost first. Sorry, Julia.
All right. Since I got really wrapped up in what Julia was saying, repeat the question.
So, with vampires being so long lived in a modern age that is so increasingly digital, how do you, within the fiction of the universe, address the fact that it's becoming harder and harder for immortal beings to hide who they are?
That is something that's definitely prevalent. I think that's something that a writer definitely has to consider. I think that is their job, because if they're writing it and if for people in the real world, they're going to know. In Sky of the Damned, everybody knows vampires exist. So, poof, that's taken care of. Yay. Well, it was a web series, and we were like, okay, well, we got, there's only so much money to film, and there's only so much we want to address in that. So, yeah, that made it the easiest. But for some of mine, we just definitely put them either in such a big group of people and they don't really talk to anyone other than the people that like other vampires and people in the supernatural world, or they're off the grid completely. They're not online. They're not using anything. And they're trying to stay off of that. And if they find out they are being tracked, they have to deal with it, which then comes down, of course, to that concept of what is your choice. But I do think it's something we have to at this stage. If you are writing this at some time that back in the day before there's internet and before there's all that, I think you get to free yourself from that a little bit, right? But I think if you're going to write in, I think that is the author's job, if you are writing in current day, that is something that at some point or another you need to address in your world build. But that's my opinion.
All right. What about you, Declan? You write in all kinds of modernity with your vampires. So how do you think you address that then? Because we've sort of established that you kind of have to if you're going to write them in modern ages. So how do you address that as a creator to give them a plausible explanation?
Well, that's actually the easy part, mainly because have you seen the scope and depth of identity theft these days? I mean, it is literally a multi-billion-dollar industry to make people disappear on a regular basis. To have one person be 5 different people, withholding God knows how many different places. A normal human could do that. If something has been around for, a few decades or a few centuries, it better be smart enough to adapt or die.
Right.
And frankly, as somebody pointed out, if you're a 100-year-old vampire and you're still broke, just walk out into the sunlight and be done with it. You're too stupid to unlive. And frankly, even if the vampire doesn't know how to do this stuff itself, it can always just hire somebody. Exactly. So there are a whole bunch of ways to do it. Me personally, I addressed it by having one of my main vampire characters having worked as a spy. So developing alternate identities was, a hobby.
Nice choice. I like it.
Thank you.
Well, the easy answer is vampires are attorneys.
I beg your pardon.
Vampires are attorneys. Modern culture with its
the Lawyers Guild got
all
him.
of the shells. Who's actually running the government? Who's actually running all of the identity services?
Okay.
Who's actually running the law schools? Vampires are attorneys.
Insert lawyer as bloodsucker joke here.
Yes.
All right. we like some lawyers, so we can't go not all, right? All right. We asked you last, Griffin, because you got a kind of an unfair advantage with your background, but how would you go about it if you were going to create a plausible explanation shy of, well, everyone knows vampires are real, so I don't have to worry about it?
Well, it really comes into play, like Tamsin and everybody has said, is that pawns on the playing board. If the vampires lived long enough, they're going to know how to manipulate the system. If you also have stuff like ghouls, where they're the servant has no choice but to do what the vampire tells them to do, then obviously they're going to be able to have a day walking influence on what's going on. So, cases get called off. Lawyers decide they don't want to prosecute a case because of something. There's lots of cool stuff you can do with playing around with that. And if you involve like a hierarchy among the vampires, now you've got even more fun to be had as far as, just somebody getting somebody else got because they are in a political feud with them and they want them discovered or want them exposed. But the story may lie in the young vampire, right? The young vampire who doesn't have any influence aside from whatever they can reach out and touch with their fingertips. So the spy that Declan's talking about is probably a really cool idea, given that they probably already have accrued some influence or at least have read the book on how to influence people, kind of stuff. So yeah, it really involves much more about what stage of life you want them to be at, and also whether or not they're the protagonist or the antagonist. If you want to set them up as the antagonist, then that's a lot of fun. If you got a bunch of humans trying to track down this person, this leech that has set themselves up to be, like they own the chief of police, they own the district attorney, they own the mayor, all that kind of stuff, it becomes rapidly intense and very noir in aspects of it. So yeah, there's a lot of fun we had.
So what is it you think about vampires that makes them so popular that the several tropes and several sort of styles of literature have come and gone, but vampires have sort of been around? What is it about them that makes them so eternally popular? All right, David, we haven't let you talk first yet. So what about you? What do you think makes them so eternally popular?
Power.
Okay. That's simple for you. Okay. What about you, Declan?
Well, the ability to live forever does have its certain lore. And of course, most vampires do seem to be, even with the exception of Bram Stoker, because his Dracula was kind of old and ugly. Most vampires have been, yes, well, they all look exceptionally good to one degree or another. We won't go into sparkling because we all know that vampires only sparkle when they're covered in napalm. So, yeah, power, the ability to live forever. And there is a mindset where, congratulations, you are now something more. It's kind of the Ubermensch, only, with fangs and a bloodlust, because now you're more than a person. Now you're a person plus. If you don't mind not going out into the sun and avoiding churches for the rest of your life. But there's always that kind of attitude lurking somewhere in it. Either that or I just saw Frank Langella's Dracula last week and it still stuck with me.
I think they're popular not just because of the attributes of being a vampire, but if depending what genre you're in, being the object of desire of the vampire is it's a universal fantasy, right? So if the vampire is fabulously wealthy and attractive, that's the same whether they're a vampire or still alive, right? That's and yet they chose you. This there's that element of appeal, right? That is a universal fantasy. Also, if you're in a world where vampires turn other vampires and that's how you become made, the notion is you turn attractive vampires, right? Like you are picking people in their prime to become vampires. So there's also that notion too that they are the prettiest ones.
Okay. Tamsin, you got anything to add to that? That what makes the vampire mythos so popular?
I was trying to think back to what drew me into some of the first ones I read. And for me, it was the ability to do extraordinary things that, especially because I do believe I started reading them when I was in high school or at least thereabouts. and they had the power to really take control of their world. And when you're younger and you don't have that, it's attractive. Also, those who are afraid of dying or of not being beautiful or all the things we've already mentioned, those are obviously things. I mean, I think some of the biggest ones are we don't age, but then as you start writing vampires more, like you write your first vampire and oh yeah, it's great, I don't age. And as you start getting older yourself, you start thinking about, dear God, if I had to do this for another 4,000 or 5,000 years, like you start to think about how would I feel about that? And I think it adds an interesting layer to it. Kind of like how Marvel started doing the whole thing of what are the repercussions of our actions of saving the world, all the people that get hurt and killed and die, and the fact that how does that affect everyone else around them. And I think that that is also an interesting draw as far as finding something to really give you something to fight against and figure out and giving them some real agency. um, I have a background in theater, and so inner dialogue and that kind of stuff really is something for me. And so I think that's another thing that I really loved about vampires was that getting into their head. And the writers, if it's done well, there's this great difference between who they are when they're older and then this younger person that they're chasing or talking to or whatever's in the story. And I think that's something that we find interesting, the idea of not aging and staying beautiful and still getting to learn and become wiser and having money to actually do the things we want to do and traveling the world. I mean, what about any of that isn't attractive? And so I think it's not just one thing. I think it's a culmination of all of that put together into this fantasy for us, up to the point where even if they aren't good guys, it's still attractive. And I think that is the key there, that it doesn't matter if they're good or bad or if they're on the line. I think the fact that you mix not aging and being attractive and having the money and being wiser, hopefully, that is interesting to all of us, especially if they're then attracted to this person and that person is modeled after you, or you can put yourself in that place. That's my long answer. Sorry.
No, long answers are good. All right, Griffin.
So,
what about you? What do you?
Yeah, I mean, everything Tamsin said plus one plus two. The key there too, though, is at what cost?
Mm-hmm.
What are they having to sacrifice to live as long as they live? And then also, to what degree are they, Bram Stoker's, in Bram Stoker's, that Dracula has outlived everybody they ever knew, except for those kind of mindless vampires.
Renfield, yeah.
But he wasn't intended to survive at all, right? He's just a slave that's going to be, discarded eventually anyway. But the women that he is, his concubines or whatever that he's taken over time, they're all vampires, but they seem kind of mindless. I don't know. Maybe that's my take on the movie, or I haven't read it in 20 years, but he discovers his first love again, and that is what brings him out of Carpathia and into the world again, into London, into this potentially high risk environment, is seeking that love that he had back when he was mortal. So that kind of thing, to be able to, it's one thing, as Tamsin was talking about, we get older, our friends pass away, our mentors pass away. The only thing that appeals to me about being immortal is if I don't have any of the pains that aging influences me. I'm not so worried about dying because it's over, right? But the pain and shit that I'm going through, I don't want any more of that than I have to have.
If I gotta have sciatica for all eternity,
right? Screw that. Yeah, no mortality for me. Thank you very much. But the opportunity to meet again with someone and that you connected with would be pretty fantastic. And I could see that as a good motivating factor, or something that's part of the reason why I think that Bram Stoker in particular is hung around, is because it's also about this monster who has a twisted love for someone. And that person has no idea who it is that is in love with them and why they're in love with them at all. And it's facing into that predator, that creature of power that could end you in a moment. and yet chooses you. Makes it very very palatable to most people who want to read it. You know, that it's like, wow, this could be me, or it could be somebody special. Every reader wants to feel like they're the special person.
And not to mention,
yeah.
Not to mention with the enduring qualities overall, it is such a variable and endlessly varied concept. Good Lord, I've seen vampires as an Atlantean nanotechnology, Greek curses, demons. Again, I did the supernatural head cold thing. And those are just the ones I can come up with off the top of my head. That doesn't even include Bram Stoker.
My favorite in film is Life Force. It's awesome. Patrick Stewart. It's an amazing film, but they're space vampires, and that's literally the title of the book that it's based off of.
I have
What about you?
This classic space
I was about
vampires.
to say, I don't miss this. And you say Patrick Stewart, I'm down. I don't really give a damn what the hell they're doing. I'm down to watch him. I've seen him on Broadway. He's wonderful. I will go to anything.
So yeah, it's mid '80s space vampires and zombies and all Renfields. It's crazy. It's very cool.
Now I have to see this. 80s says it all.
Yes.
There's a certain something about that era of movies. So what about you, Tamsin? Do you have a favorite vampire movie?
Oh, jeez. Why do you call me first on that one? You're fired.
Well, Griffin mentioned it first. I'm just riffing on what he did.
I think that, gosh, what did I watch the other day? I was rather impressed. Is it Dracula Untold? Not a great film, but I enjoyed the shit out of that thing, and I don't even know why. Like I'd have to look back and be like, I don't know. Like it's just, and I really enjoyed it. I don't know if that's my favorite.
Sometimes popcorn is awesome.
Right? Like sometimes it really is. But like, I'm trying to think of other vampire movies. I mean, obviously, I really did love when they did Dracula. Not because it's a classic, but because Gary Oldman just as an actor, someone who's worked with actors as my previous job, I had to love his work on that. But I don't really have one that I'm thinking of at the moment. I'm sure that will change the minute everyone says theirs. And I'm, oh yeah. But as a kid, Lost Boys was my jam.
Okay.
Lost Boys was my jam in a big way.
Julia, what about you? Do you have a favorite vampire movie? We're going to get to books next. So right now we're focusing on film.
I loved Lost Boys. I saw it in the theater. I live 45 minutes from Santa Cruz, so it's kind of special to me geographically. But actually, I loved the TV show Dark Shadows when I was younger, and I love the reboot also. So it's funny. I know that there are iconic movies like Lestat, but I just like that TV show. It was a little cheesy, but it really hit something for me.
Okay. David, what about you?
I'm not really much of a video person, so I can't say that I have a hugely favorite show. The one that did register with me was Dracula 2000. Just the staging and the imagery, the effects of it.
Who's the lead in that?
Dracula was being played by Leonidas from 300. Gerard Butler.
Oh, maybe that's the one I'm thinking of that I love so much. They blur sometimes, y'all. I watched a lot of shit during the pandemic.
Well, it was weird. It was kind of weird watching Gerard Butler running around looking like he came off the cover of a romance novel.
Right?
It's like, dude, put your shirt on, please.
Is that the one with the cover where it's kind of gray and there's lots of flying? That might be the one that I did love for no reason other than it was popcorn worthy. I'd have to go over there and look, but whatever. Yes.
I have to admit to being curious to what the new version of Interview with the Vampire is like.
I have not seen it. Has anyone seen it?
I don't think it's out yet, right? It comes out this month sometime.
I thought
Yeah.
I saw someone talk about maybe they got to see something early.
There's been some clips on Facebook, so if it's not out now, it should be soon.
Also, I'm friends with a lot of people in the biz, so they might have seen some of it and talked about things. That's what I might be thinking of. So,
Oops. All right. What about you, Declan? Do you have a favorite vampire movie?
I'm largely torn between the original Bela Lugosi and the Frank Langella 1975 version, although I must admit the Langella version I mostly like for the John Williams soundtrack. Anyway, it's been running through my head for the last hour. But yeah, I like Dracula 2000 well enough. There were some elements where it's like, what was the decision here? But in the 2000 version is interesting, if only because of all the varied and sundry people who are in it, from Jerry Ryan from Voyager to Gerard Butler, who, gee, I wonder if he had a career. Johnny Lee Miller, who I tripped over later on as one of the 3 different Sherlock TV shows. Even Christopher Plummer playing, 120-year-old Van Helsing. But so that was interesting. But I'd probably have to go for the 1975 version. Again, John Williams makes everything awesome. Just see Jaws.
I don't know. For me, I like the Underworld franchise. It had the vampires and the werewolves. That was
Yes.
really good.
Totally
Yes.
forgot about that.
Also,
There-
Blade.
Yeah, I was gonna say Blade was my other one. Certain Somebody in Tight Leather was, as a guy at a certain age when those came out. I'm just saying, it is what it is. But
The earliest films that I ever dug that was vampires, Nosferatu, 1922.
I'm hoping you're not that old, but you could be a vampire and we wouldn't know.
I'm saying as far as just like zero special effects, all lighting, all like just creepy, and totally unauthorized. Didn't have any they just rough rided it. It's like, let's go.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember who they're doing in the remake of Nosferatu. It's like, guys, couldn't you just do another Dracula?
Yeah.
It's been 20 years since the last one I remember.
Well, they had one that was like the filming it with Willem Dafoe.
Shadow of the Vampire.
Shadow of the Vampire. It's also
yes, Willem Dafoe and I'm trying to remember who played the director. I can see his face. It'll come to me again 5 minutes after we're done talking.
that T-shirt is better.
It's the
All right,
Psycho from In the Line of Fire and Con Air. And
Hey, Con Air has its pluses.
yeah, but the bad guy
Nicolas
was
Cage.
No. Who was the bad guy? And not Ving Rhames.
Steve Buscemi.
Steve Buscemi is the heart of that film. What are you talking about?
That's going to drive me nuts until I look at the bloody thing up. John
I know it's
Malkovich.
driving me nuts. And that
Malkovich,
movie is
yeah,
right over
gotcha.
there on my shelf.
Malkovich.
All right, I gotta know.
So while she's looking that up, we've talked about favorite movies. David, you said you're more of a reader than a watcher of the television. So do you have a favorite vampire book other than your own, of course?
I have 2 that I'll nominate. Robin McKinley's Sunshine, I think, is just a superb piece of work that kind of turns the whole paranormal romance thing almost on its ear. And then one that we haven't talked about, Barbara Handley several years ago, maybe 20 years ago, began a series with a book entitled Those Who Hunt the Night, which is set in Victorian England. And that affected me because that series connected with me because I felt her characters were plausible. They just really felt real to me.
Okay. What about you, Declan? You're well read. Do you have a favorite literary vampire?
You mean aside from my own and the Love at First Bite quartet coming back from Three Ravens Press?
Absolutely. Nice product placement, though. I give you extra points for that.
Thank you. I'm getting better, honest. I've taken notes. I've got a cheat sheet. One of the ones I've enjoyed that has fun with the concept is the vampire romance by Carolyn Sparks, who is entertaining, treats the vampires as supernatural, and is half comedy, and then it turns into an action flick. Especially when, our primary vampire used to be a monk. He's gotten saner, and he owns the patents on synthetic blood, and it's entertaining. The first book was he bites into a synthetic human that has blood running through its veins, and he breaks a tooth, so he has to go to the dentist. However, for somebody who takes it seriously, I recommend Dan Simmons, his book Children of the Night. Yes, it is taken directly from the Bela Lugosi stage play and film, but it's probably one of the better ones I've read as a serious, straight-up vampire novel. But then again, this is Dan Simmons. He can literally write in any genre he likes.
Okay. What about you, Griff? Do you have a favorite literary vampire?
Yeah, it's got to go with Bram Stoker. It just, if nobody else is going to take it, I'm taking it. The origin, right? And like I said, that whole when you imagine somebody is immortal, reasons to live really kind of figure into it. And looking for that love that you lost would be a pretty damn good reason to live. And that's what I really enjoy about Bram Stoker's original Dracula.
Okay. Julia, what about you? Do you have a favorite one from literature?
I do. I love Charlene Harris's True Blood series. I didn't watch that much of the HBO series. It was actually very different than the novels, and I've reread the novels many times. They're just brilliantly written, laugh out loud, funny, and I really enjoyed the protagonist Suki Stackhouse, right, and her relationship with the vampires, and it's zany but wildly entertaining. And also in that world, there's no veil. Right, the vampires are not a secret. They're out in the world. They drink synthetic blood at a diner with you, right?
Okay. Tamsin, you care to weigh in?
Yeah. Interestingly enough, it changed for me. When I was younger, Anne Rice was my favorite. That was the vampire genre. And then as I got a little older, which is funny because as I got older, I read some younger books, which is hilarious. But L.J. Smith, now everybody knows of the Vampire Diaries, and they know the TV show. They don't know the books necessarily. Books are very different, obviously, because that always happens. But I must have reread that original trilogy of that series more times than I care to count. So much so that when I saw the preview for the TV show, I went, oh, hell no, that is not like, and then I ended up having to watch it so I could be on panels for it for Dragon Con. But that was my favorite. It really was. It was one of the ones that I just loved, and the original story. I really just had a thing. I just really loved it tremendously as a young person, and it still holds that place in my heart because of that, I think. And by the way, I did find it. It was Dracula Untold.
Okay.
Easy thing that I fell in love with during the pandemic that I watched. Yeah.
Okay. So as we bring this puppy to a close, we've covered everything and nothing that there is to do with vampires. I've had an enjoyable time. But as we wrap this up, I'm going to give you each a chance to tell us what you're working on now and how readers, listeners, viewers can find you. So we're going to start with you, Griffin, because we're going top to bottom.
So I can be found probably at Dragon Con next year, Liberty Con, I'm hoping as well. But I'm done with cons for the year. I have several short stories coming out or just came out, like today. My short story, The Key, about a dragon, came out in World Shapers Volume 3 with a huge list of celebrity writers, and I'm like, yeah, I'm there with you. And then I've got an homage to a mutual friend of David and mine, Rick Boatwright, that's going to be out in World's Long Lost, which is another Baen anthology that be coming out in January, I think. And a couple of other short stories you're working on as well as the ubiquitous novel, etc. So I've got a few things coming out.
So we will link to all of his show notes or all of his social media links in the show notes. And did they give you the and many more patch when you got into that anthology?
Actually, no. I've had the and many mores, and actually on World's Long Lost, I'm actually on the cover. And
well done, you're moving up in the world.
The most recent noir one too. I'm on the cover as well, so I'm like,
outstanding. All right, what are you working on right now, Declan? Probably like 12 books at once, but and then how can they find you?
Only working on 5. I'm currently working on the sequel to my vampire series. The sequel series is called Honeymoon from Hell because, yeah, my quote-unquote vampire romance ended in a happily ever after, and then they keep coming after them because why not? But I'm working on that right now. The original Love at First Bite set is coming from Three Ravens Press, so I'm kind of working on that with them. My last publisher, Silver Empire, had 25 of my books published, maybe. So I'm still picking up the pieces from that while I'm trying to move to Texas. Anyway, you can find me online at almost every social media site except for BitChute, mainly because I can't figure out how to work that one yet. But I'm on Gab as Declan Finn Books on Twitter. I'm on a Substack, declanfinn.substack. Declanfinn.com is my blogger site. Again, Facebook. Again, you type my name in, you'll find me somewhere.
All right. What about you, David? What are you working on now, and how can the listeners and viewers find you?
Finding me is fairly easy. There's not too many David Carrico fiction writers out there, although I have to warn you, there's a right-wing evangelist out there who has the same name. So if you see David L. Carrico, that is not me. Currently, I am working on my third and unfortunately final collaboration with Eric Flint. It's a space opera with the working title of Hydra. I'm not very far into it, but I have a couple of other things that are in progress, but Hydra's got the front burner right now.
Okay. So, Julia, can you tell listeners what you're working on, and then what that you're allowed to talk about, and then where they can find you?
Yeah, I'm deep into the novel drafting of Bricks and Murder, which is book 2 in our Seattle Slayers series. It will be coming out later this year. With Tor, we are still waiting on a cover, and so we don't even have art yet for that book. But the pre-order links are up, and it comes out in July for 2023. So Ebony Gate in July of 2023.
With a title like that, you should have picked one of the Griffin Barber trademark backgrounds of the brick wall. It would have been too perfect.
I've been having fun with the Midjourney AI and generating all kinds of really fun concept art that's just to inspire my writing, and I really recommend it as a tool for just.
I will get with you after this about that AI, because I've heard
Yes.
about people doing this AI created imagery for the fun of it, and it might be worth playing with just for reasons, because sometimes we need thumbnails.
Well, it's really great as a visualization tool for your writing.
Outstanding. All right, Tamsin, what are you working on right now, and how can listeners and viewers find you?
Currently, I am doing the edits from book 1 of the trilogy Moon Over Manhattan, which is as it sounds, a werewolf novel in New York. But we've got everyone else in that involved. Most recently that came out was book 3 in the Billy the Kid trilogy, The Murder of Cricket Cougar. Let me get that centered.
Yay!
Such a great cover. I love it. It's just creepy enough and great for this time of year. Self-plug. And other than that, you can find me. Tamsin Silver is not a popular name. When I took it as my name for writing, there was one person with that name out in England who wrote some paper on the Third Reich and the war Thankfully, now if you look it up, she is buried pages down in Google. So if you look up Tamsin Silver, you won't find her anymore. You'll find everything for me. But that's what I'm under, and anything just like Declan said, if you put it in somewhere, you're gonna find me on that social media.
Okay. And you can find us on Twitter at twitter.com/SF_fantasy_show, Sierra Foxtrot _fantasy_show. You can email us at blastersandbladespodcast@gmail.com. Again, blastersandbladespodcast@gmail.com. We have a Facebook group where all the shenanigans happen over at facebook.com/groups/Blasters and Blades Podcast. Again, /groups/Blasters and Blades Podcast. We have a website over on anchor.fm/blasters-and-blades. Again, anchor.fm/blasters-and-blades, where for as little as 99 cents a month, you can help keep the lights on. And last but not least, you can support the show more directly over at buymeacoffee.com/author J.R. Handley. Again, buymeacoffee.com/author J.R. Handley. Be sure to put in the comment section that it is for the podcast, and I promise I will buy copious amounts of garlic to protect Doc Cisca and Nick Garber from all the bitey, stabby vampires out there. But we wanted to thank you for spending some of your precious time with us. I know it's cheesy, but it's the season, so I had to go with it. So thank you for spending your time with us. We'll be back next week at the same time, where we'll indulge our love of nerd culture, cheesy jokes, and all things that go boom. And I want to thank each and every one of you for joining us tonight. It was great. You did great. It was outstanding. We'll have to have you guys all back at different times for different things because you're all awesome.